Right, hello everyone, and welcome to this History Indoors. I would say talk, but I guess it's going to be more of a kind of a discussion, which I'm really looking forward to. So, welcome everyone, and it's great to have you with us, and we do hope that you enjoy this. Do Before we begin, do like the video and subscribe to the channel because the more the merrier, as we say, and we're on our way to 1,600 subscribers. So we'd like to have you on that journey. So please do those things. There's loads of videos there as well for any history lover. There'll be loads of videos for you to watch. So please do um, watch those, get involved, and the like. So please do that. Whether you like ancient history or modern history, there's something really for everyone. Our last talk a couple weeks ago was about archaeological digs. So very different to what we're perhaps discussing today. But that's the fun of history, isn't it? There's so much we can talk about and so much we can do. Well, today I'm joined with some guests actually from the Wales to Nowhere podcast, and it's absolutely great to have them with me. So I'll let them introduce themselves before we begin. So why don't you both introduce yourselves so people know who you are and what you do?
Hello, I'm Simon. I am a amateur historian of railway public transport history, and one of the two hosts of Rails to Nowhere podcast on railway history. I graduated end of last year from the University of York with an MA in Railway Studies, which I wrote my thesis on the response of the London Passenger Transport Board to the arrival of the motorcar and new forms of mobility in the 1930s. And that is the crux of what I'm going to be bringing to today's discussion alongside my co-host Ella.
Hi, I'm Ella, also known as Zach. I suppose I would say I'm a historian with many question marks after that. I just finished my MA. I recently graduated from QM, where I wrote about the Jersey Railways and Tramways, a fascinating example of an isolated communities railway. And I think that's kind of what I'm here to talk about is this topic in context of smaller and more isolated groups, and maybe also talk about like some weird things about London too, because why not?
Yeah,
my bit.
We've both lived in London for many years. We both have comments on London.
Yeah, and I travel through London a lot, being from Medway and Kent, so I know London quite well as well. So I can add my 2 pence worth into that as well. Today we're talking, aren't we, about the title is the car indispensable, the train inflexible. So why don't we start off with why this topic and
Yeah.
like.
So I think that my view is I'm interested in this topic because I think the history of how we've ended up where we are with transport systems as they are today is a really important one for us to understand. So I went back for my dissertation and I looked at, well, how did we make those decisions that led to where we are today? And a lot of those originate in the 1930s. The motor car emerges in the late 1800s. We did an episode on the history of the motor car. Ella wasn't there. She was indisposed and I had someone else on the show at the time. We did an episode on it and I spent ages trying to work out exactly where the motor car and when the motor car was developed. There are many people who claim to have created the first motor car in Britain, the world, Germany, wherever. Was it Benz? I want to say it's Benz who's generally regarded as the originator in the late 1800s. But it's in the 1930s that it really begins to take on the form we know of it today, become more reliable, become more usable. And we often think of the motoring age as being the 60s and the 50s and the 60s, and a lot of focus is on that. But actually, the motorways don't appear out of nowhere in the 1950s. They are the result of decisions made in the 30s. And So, and those are inextricably tied to views on modernity and modern life, and what modern life should be, and what the modern suburbanite should be. And that's a lot of where my research has gone.
Yeah, and it's also interesting as a concept to understand how we these today can understand where we've come from and where we might be going from this. I don't believe that most solutions that are touted as solutions to our problems, be them traffic, be them mobility, be them, you know, the environment, be them all sorts of things, aren't just going to appear from nowhere. Instead, I can see them, they're going to be based on the past and also partly on um, research and development in the future, but I don't think we're going to just have nothing. And it's just going to just appear from just like someone's magic, almost like I'd say from under the trench coat of a billionaire somewhere saying, "Here's my magic solution. We will all agree to it." And I think that looking at the stuff that I look at, these smaller communities, it can help because they have to develop things on their own in many ways. You can understand how it's always a micro study of what you can do because there's so
Yeah.
little acting on it from externally.
Yeah. No, I'm just jumping on that as well. I mean, the things that we've been talking, the things that you said, the debates are contemporary, aren't they, as well? The things that the car, the train, they're contemporary debates, they're contemporary issues that are being raised in a contemporary society. And those who know me
Yes.
know that I work in place, and it's a massive talking point. The car, transport, availability, all these kind of
Yeah.
aspects. But those debates aren't necessarily new debates, are they? They've probably been around for
No.
quite some
No,
time.
and it's understand. I think it's also a debate around freedom of the individual um versus what people perceive as making them free. In
Yes.
particular, I mean, people will look at, if you said someone had a train is freedom, people might go, "What do you mean like that? It only runs from between A and B. It comes at 1843. You have to be there at 1843 or thereabouts." And if you don't get that, you're not going to get the train. How is that freedom? But then
Exactly.
but is it not the freedom to move about beyond what you could say walk?
Yeah, and this is definitely something that in my work I've found a lot of conversation about in the 1930s and before from the London Passenger Transport Board and its predecessors. And to an extent, the Underground and the London buses are an example of where, even to this day, we do that sort of freedom thing for the transport as well as we do in Britain. I mean, if you look behind me, I've got the departure board up for Arnos Grove. Deliberately, because it's a nice station of the era that I'm talking about, and it's got a train every couple of minutes, and that's a big talking point in the 1930s and before from the Underground. Is sort of like having the trains running regularly and frequently, and to such a frequency that you don't actually have to think about it. And like, yes, in many parts of the country, many places, you have to think, oh, the train comes once an hour, once every 2 hours, or every half hour, whatever, and you need to know when. And one of the big efforts that the Underground Group and the London Transport from 1933 onwards really try for is to make it so that the buses and the trains are frequent enough that you actually don't need to think about them. So they are essentially almost as good as they can be as having your own private transport. Even though, yes, you have to walk to the station and the train isn't sitting, unless you're really lucky in your house place where you've bought your house, you're not right next to the station.
It's what I'd say is making transport almost omnipresent is
Yes.
their main goal. Whereas,
Yes.
and I think that was a goal that was mostly achieved, especially in some of the more central regions of London. You can't move, you can't swing a cat for not hitting without hitting a bus or a roundel for a tube station or goodness knows what other, even things like black cabs, I would classify partly under public transportation, and they're just everywhere. And these are all icons too of the city that are known the world over.
Yeah, exactly. And also the ties to the idea of freedom as well, and this sort of comes into the urban design and the growth of cities that you were talking a bit about earlier as well, is how the railways in this era advertise their services as giving you the freedom to unlock a better and a new life. Specifically, one that I think at this point they're concerned the motor car is giving people more ability. Those who can afford a motor car, it's giving them more ability to access that lifestyle. But the railways are very keen to promote, certainly the suburban railways, certainly the underground. We think of posters for places like Metroland. They're keen to promote that they're unlocking this freedom to own your own home and live somewhere where you don't have a landlord, so you don't have somebody else running your owning your house. You can be a homeowner yourself, and the ability to access leisure time and to take command of that, because the idea of a leisure weekend and the access to a leisure weekend is growing in the early half of the 20th century. Not by any means universal necessarily at this point, but there's an increasingly affluent middle class and an increasingly affluent upper working class during the post-World War I period, and that makes it easier for people to access leisure activities, and the railways are keen to say, we can provide you the freedom of that leisure time as well.
So
actually,
so just jumping in. I mean, so do you think that? I mean, did the railways knew then in the 30s that the threat of the motor car? Did they see and perceive the threat and know that and try to market themselves in a way to almost kind of corner the market before the car grew almost in this period? Do you think?
On the part of the London Passenger Transport Board, who I've done the majority of the work on, there is clear evidence that up to the highest levels of the organisation, they were aware of the threat to their monopoly of transport in London from the motor car. There is evidence in the minute books and the various annual reports that the organisation was putting out that people as high up as Pick and Ashfield were considering the impact that the motor car was going to have on changing how people travelled. And certainly from the UERL and the Underground Electric Railways of London, that's the UERL, and the London Passenger Transport Board, or London Transport, much easier. I will refer to them as the Underground Group and London Transport because that's much easier to say. The Underground Group and London Transport were both heavily invested in having a monopoly on transport in London, so they did pick up on the motor car and they were concerned of the threat that posed to that monopoly, because it unbound people from their services. It meant that people could travel to places that, because there's only so far you can go with a horse and cart in a reasonable length of time, and a traditional hackney carriage, whilst reasonably quick, can only take you so far in a timescale that you're wanting that you would need a train to go further out into the suburbs. But suddenly the arrival of motor vehicles unlocks that sort of travel for motor travel. And I think this is one of the big reasons why the motor bus is very quickly adopted as well, because it allows the bus to continue to remain competitive against the growing threat of the motor car. And that's the other thing to remember with all of this, is in the 1930s, ownership of motor cars is not massive. It is higher in London than elsewhere in Britain. I should have pulled the figures up in front of me. I don't have them in front of me. They're in my dissertation somewhere. But the vast majority of driving licenses are held by people who live in London. So it's sort of London's at the cutting edge of this sort of discussion, but it is very much a discussion about the threat that the motor car potentially presents, rather than necessarily what's actually happening right now. Although, when we look at archive footage of London in the 1930s, you can see that there are already yes, at principal locations like Piccadilly or Victoria, we know these are busy traffic locations today, but there's already a noticeable amount of motor traffic developing in the 1930s. So they're doing surveys, they're doing reports, they're checking up on how many motor vehicles are traveling. The Metropolitan Police, London Transport, they're doing surveys, checking on the motor travel. They are monitoring this, so they're very much aware of it.
And it's very much the same on Jersey. The transport company out there, the two main ones were the Jersey Motor Transport Company, who ran buses, and the Jersey Railways and Tramways Company, who ran trains. Very, very small train network, I should point out. They were very aware.
Even a network.
Yeah, well, you can put it that way. Yeah, they were very aware that the arrival of the motor car on the island had a massive impact on how many on their patronage. The railways move in the 1920s to reduce costs to make so they can keep their fares lower and more competitive. Bless you. More competitive compared to the car, and obviously compared to, more importantly, the bus, who come along and very much start stealing their thunder, because they can go to more places, they can go there maybe not as quick, they're slightly slower than taking the train, because Jersey's roads are a little more I describe them as a little less well kept in places than ones in London, but they still end up. But the advantage they have is, unlike the railways, which are stuck, or the railway which is stuck to one route between Corbière via a couple of major population centres and terminates in St Helier, the bus can go to places like St Peter's or St John, which is the other side of the island to where the railway is. So they're aware of the threat that's coming, and they know that people are moving onto the bus too, because they're seeing their revenue drop. When they do eventually buy the bus company, they can just see that more people are willing to travel by bus, because rather than changing to a train, you can now take a one-seat ride straight into town.
Yep.
And at the same time, you've got the car coming along too, and it's not taking off massively at this time, but it's still there's already things being written into the newspapers at this time complaining about things like dangerous motoring, people being inconsiderate in cars, how noisy they are, the space they take up, all sorts of different things.
Yeah,
and this is in the 1920s and 30s.
Yeah, and this is stuff I've picked up in my research as well, is finding newspaper letters, or even little articles in local papers. Two that stick in mind was one complaining about the level of motor traffic following a Arsenal game at Finsbury Park, and another complaining about the gridlock on the Uxbridge Road on a summer Saturday, both in the sort of mid-1930s, because of the sheer number of people driving motor vehicles departing the same location at the same time. Now, the problem is these articles don't say whether this gridlock is from 10 vehicles that are just all sat at one junction, and that's a huge number to people in those days, or if it's from the thousands. It's not going to be the thousands we would expect today, but it's evident that people are aware of this, and this is something that's starting to happen. And it's interesting seeing these same complaints that we see today of there's congestion, there's gridlock, this event has kicked out, everybody got in their car at the same time, and suddenly the road is overwhelmed by this peak in the demand. And as we were saying earlier, these are the same things that people talk about now. These are the same problems, and they have the same potential answers today as they did in the 1930s.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is, while the underground has always been what we would describe as a very congested system, it's still not something that's complained about, I would say, on the same level as the motor car, because it's not affecting where people live in the same way. Yes, a train may roll past your window every couple of minutes, but a train of and I suppose a tube train holds about 800-900 people probably on a good day.
Yeah.
That's not the same as 800-900 motor vehicles rolling past your window
Yes.
every day.
Yeah.
Well, it would not even be in the same window type, in order of magnitude longer time.
Yes.
And what fascinates me there, just very quickly as well, just jumping in, is the fact that those complaints which are there, same as you said, same today. Yet the car still and the motorized still took off, even though there were complaints about it already. I also wondered if there was any complaints about the smell as well of the motor car, because obviously things like smell and things that would maybe reflected population areas as well. If that had people noting that as well, because of course the fumes from the engines, for example, if that had any impact on people's experience of their places and the like.
So I've not done any specific research into this, but I do know, as an interesting aside, that very often the motor car was actually seen as a less polluting though the motor engine was often seen as being less polluting than what came before, because horses are filthy.
Yes.
And a lot of cities, like in the Victorian and the 1800, the Victorian era in the 1800s, they had a serious public health issue from all the manure that's being left on the roads. But no, I've not necessarily come across a lot from the engine exhaust per se. Thinking about it, there's a couple of references I can think of to people complaining about buses idling, and also notably complaints from the noise of the wheels of early motor buses, because before they had pneumatic tires and they have hard rubber, or even before that, they have quite loud. They're quite loud on the roads, especially when you've got cobbled roads or not very well paved roads. This is partially where tarmac comes from. This is part of why tarmac gets invented, is because the ride is not great, because this is before modern suspension, and because the noise is quite loud, and actually there is a demand for a new smooth road surface to try and bring those aspects down and into comfort. This is one of the reasons as well why the motor bus initially is less preferred by certain people than the tram, although in London that's a bit, or in a lot of places that's a bit weird, because the tram is very much a working class form of transport, whereas the bus is a little more respectable for the middle classes, at least. But the tram, at least initially, still provides a much more comfortable journey, because the rails allow it to be smoother, and you see a lot of people sort of being like, or you see a lot of reference to the fact that there's a sort of trade-off between the speed and flexibility of a motor bus versus the comfort
Tram
and quiet, to an extent, of the tram, up until they start getting pneumatic tires and the comfort starts to come down, and then the tram becomes the noisy one, because you've got the noise of the squeal of the rails and all of that sort of stuff that comes with it. And the motor bus is now becoming a little bit quieter. So it's interesting how these sort of things wax and wane and change as an advance is made in one. Suddenly it becomes better than the other. And you see that throughout, because you then see advances with trams, with things like the Feltnam tram, which bring in better comfort and slightly better wheels and slightly less noise, and enclosed decks entirely. With the buses and the trams in London, that's a real sort of back and forth, is enclosing the upper deck and enclosing the driver's cab. And there's a whole debate at one point where the Met Police, who licensed trams in the early 30s, they're okay for trams to have roofs on the upper deck but not windscreens, and buses can have windscreens but they can't have roofs on the upper deck. I don't pretend to understand it, but this is all sort of stuff that sort of comes and goes at various points.
And what you just said there, just very there, is sensitive, that the idea that it kind of wanes and one takes the kind of priority. that's what happened today as well, isn't it? Really, is the fact that, I mean, look at recent announcements, new tram network in Leeds, for example, trams coming back as they've become more popular, perhaps, and other
Yes.
other services become less popular. So you see that, don't we? That there's this continuous, isn't there? This continuous, almost, I would say, battle almost to kind of gain people's favour as a transport
But-
Yeah,
system.
and
was gonna say,
sorry, Alan, go ahead.
So it also seems to be true for the health concern regarding this stuff too, because when one of the things was brought out to help with the noise of engines was leaded petrol, supposed to reduce knocking and all sorts of problems with engines and the noise they made. But there was a public outcry at one point about the use of leaded petrol. Isn't lead the poisonous thing that's going to kill us all? And then the public concern slowly wanes through various corporate campaigns and all sorts of various reasons. People kind of lose interest in it, and then it returns. People become very concerned with lead, and now people are concerned with just nitrous oxide emissions and carbon emissions from exhaust. And now that there's this debate about, do we go for hydrogen cars which only produce water, or do we go for lithium battery cars which, while they are in theory not polluting, still have the issues of salt on the road, the rubber tire pollutants, and of course not forgetting the pollutants when you extract the materials needed to make these batteries. It's just, are we going to push the problem over there, or are we going to try and actively solve the problem?
Yeah.
And that's not to say that things like trams also aren't polluting. It's just they don't get the same attention, because the pollutants that trams give off are mostly things like brake dust and
Yeah,
I
and the
suppose
really
like metal
noxious,
filings, not
the really
noxious
noxious
things that you
fumes
can
are
taste.
somewhere else. The
Yes.
noxious fumes are somewhere else. It's the same you see with electric cars now, where people sort of see them as being clean and nice and new because we don't like to think where the electricity comes from, and they can be,
Never mind that most of
as a
it is
tram
probably
can be.
natural gas.
And yeah, and these are the same sort of debates we have, and where we see the motor car begin to gain an interest and a following in the 1930s and then onwards into the 1960s. And we see the railway companies begin to try and fight back against that in this period. Obviously, I keep bringing it back to the underground because that's where my expertise is. And in London, we see that with an adoption of the modern stylings and the modern design to try and lure people in. So we see better comfort. I mentioned earlier the improvements to the trams and the buses. So we get buses that, once they're allowed, we get buses with upper deck roofs and windows, and that means you can begin having upholstery upstairs. That either you'd had only wooden benches upstairs or some really, really
Soggy.
beaten up, soggy upholstery. So you start getting more comfortable seats. You start getting bigger buses. You get trains like the 1938 tube stock, which has all sort of fantastic Art Deco shapes and smooth sides and nice seats inside and nice finishes. And then you get the modern stations. And this is very clearly a sort of response to the way that the car and the aeroplane and the ocean liner in this era are being advertised and sold as sort of modern design and modern marvels, and the railways trying to fight back against that. Not all the railway companies do that necessarily. Some of them drag their heels a little bit. The Metropolitan in London especially is quite traditionalist, and I was talking about this with our latest episode, on our most recent episode that came out with our guests there, about how their 1930s stations, while they have aspects of Art Deco in them, they are much more reserved and much more harking back to the Victorian era. But in the underground group, which is much more forward facing, we have Charles Holden, who is he's not their principal architect, he's their principal consulting architect. I always like to make a point that Stanley Heaps is the underground group's actual architect at this point. But Holden is doing most of or his firm is doing most of the designs and all the sort of big stations we know of, places like Arnos Grove and Sudbury Town, and working on rebuilds of Piccadilly Circus and Green Park and all of these sort of big stations. and they're bringing a new, clean design, a modern aesthetic that firmly plants the Underground as a modern system fit for the modern age. Because as much as we might not want it to be the case, we might just want people to travel based on the actual practicality of the system and the actual usefulness of the system, and those are important. The aesthetics are also very important, and this is I'm very much on sort of the view that the railway and public transport should be nice to travel on, as well as providing the service that we need. I don't want to be on an. I got on on my way home the other week. I was on a bus that was
Squeaky,
10, 15
rattly.
years old. I sent Ella the picture. I don't know how old that bus was, but it was as old as I remember those sort of buses from when I was a kid, and it feels unpleasant compared to a more modern vehicle. Not just because it's old and rattly, but also just because it's less comfortable and less visually pleasing. And
Yeah,
this is what the Underground Group's doing at the time. It's taking its old stuff and saying, right, let's get rid of. And there's a wonderful poster of Euston Station from after it was rebuilt in the 1930s, where you've got the old City and South London Railway locomotive next to a modern 1923 tube stock train, and you've got the Edwardian gentlemen and ladies on one side, sort of ghosted out, and the 1920s with all their sort of nice clothing from the 1920s, and it's contrasting how well we were that, and now we are moving into the modern age. We're the modern system for the modern era, and that's a big push we see across the railway, both on mainline and the Underground in this period. Sorry, go ahead, Ella.
So what's also interesting is it manages to cross to places like Jersey and Guernsey, where obviously buses are starting to be introduced. They get double deckers, and people are marveling at the idea of a bus can have 2 floors on it. What a great invention! And they also get double deckers that are enclosed from the start because they're not bound by the same rules. But interestingly, when the railway replaces its rolling stock in the 1920s to cut costs and bring a more efficient system, they buy new stock that is very much at the bleeding edge of design, not because it was the only thing on offer, but because they wanted to project an image that we are a modern system, we are a modern railway. We're trying to break new ground with this, not just be a backwards thing that with our lovely little chuff train. No, look at us. We've got the modern design where it's like an all-in-one rail car rather than just a locomotive with some carriages strung behind it. And it's really interesting how in places like Jersey, where they maybe aren't as beholden to regulation as, say, somewhere like London would be, you get this war kind of really heat up because you've got the ability to just kind of buy the best of the best, not because you can necessarily afford the best of the best, but because you're trying to win over as many people as possible to you, and you can do that by doing things like we're not going to buy a bus with a open top on it. That's the old times. We're going to buy a bus that's enclosed and it's warm and it's heated, whereas the train doesn't have heating until the rail cars come along, because the coaches are, well, you can't really, they could heat them, but they don't have steam heating because it's a very basic railway. And it's this kind of this fight goes on in these places almost in many ways more intensely because they don't have someone standing over them with a big stick going, but you can only have a windshield, you can't have a roof.
Yeah. I just jump in as well, just to talk about that idea of the experience matters of the journey. Because if you take a town, for example, if you go to a town centre and it's a nice experience, you go back to it. If it's a bad experience, you won't go back to it. Same principle, isn't it, here with the trains, for example, is that they wanted to provide a good experience. The people would then want to go back to it and use it again.
It's I think it's really true now, and I think it's why we see people today get so outside London and outside places like London and Manchester and bits and certain areas of Scotland too, where people are so jaded with public transport. And I've recently had to travel a lot on buses that aren't London buses, and every time I get on them, I think, hang on, I was a kid when this bus was inserted. Like the ALX 400 came out around the a few years after I was born, and I'm getting on, and they were drawn from London in like 2009, and I'm getting on what was probably an ex-London bus that someone's bought, repainted purple, and then is selling as the only service, but from East Armpit to nowhere, and I have to take it because I can't drive. And I understand why people get so jaded with this stuff, because the buses come once every like 3 hours, and it's a rattly piece of junk that is uncomfortable. It smells. The seats haven't been done up since it probably left London service. You probably guessed who it was working with, where it was. But but it's what's being touted as the only service, because apparently we've lost sight of what passenger experience is outside of a few select regions, I think, at least in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, and it's taking you from one nondescript side of a road, which maybe has a bus shelter, maybe not a very nice one, maybe it's got a seat, maybe it hasn't.
It has like a shelter, but doesn't have a seat.
Yeah, to another place that is also not particularly pleasant. And this was one of the interesting things I found when researching my dissertation and latterly episodes on For Rails to Nowhere, is I mentioned the architecture of the railway stations and the tube stations in London, but also actually the effort that London Transport puts into not necessarily every bus stop, not necessarily every waiting place, but it puts in efforts to have nicer facilities at bus stops, especially principal ones. So there's a couple of examples like Cockfosters and Southgate, where the bus stops are integrated in with the tube station as well. But there are other examples where they just design bus shelters and bus stands, either as part of bus depots, as sort of bus stations. So this is going to sound very strange, me talking about London Transport this far out, but in places like St Albans, they develop a bus station, and again in Tunbridge, because London Transport buses go way further out in the 1930s than they do now. Well, St Albans is served by red London Transport buses in the 1930s.
Yeah.
The London Transport in the 1930s goes all the way up to Luton in the north and almost as far as Red Hill in the south. It's huge. But they develop these spaces to make the travel nicer, to make it better, to put it on a par, deliberately to try and put it on a par with the underground that they're developing as well, to give those modern facilities. And as you say, that's often a thing that's lacking nowadays. It's something that's sort of overlooked, and I think that's a shame. And I think it is certainly a reason, alongside reliability and frequency of service, of course, as to why people may or may not like a piece of transport.
Yeah, I can say today. I can say today. I can feel the question going, but I just want to say that today, like I've had to travel at one point through Luton bus station during a rail strike. I have never been more. I can describe it as frustrated, because the bus came late. It got to the destination late. I missed a bus that I was connecting to by a few minutes, and ended up being the only place nearby that was open, warm, and I could like actually be comfortable in was a Starbucks. And I had to pay, and I don't particularly like Starbucks coffee. I had to pay money to go and access a space to be warm, to be dry, to be comfortable. Whereas if these considerations were maybe thought of a bit more by people who design these spaces, maybe that would have just been a room with some comfortable seats, maybe obviously a departure board, and it would just be comfortable to be in, like waiting rooms once were. And I'm not trying to be jaded about like the past was better, because there are many things about the past that were worse, but it's interesting how this stuff has kind of been swept away into instead for purely hostile environments, I'd describe them.
There's definitely hasn't there been a move. I mean, away from looking after public space, and that is the thing that I think again across quite a variety of different places where you find the public space has been pushed out for private spaces, as you said, and so you actually see a decline in that, which I think is interesting. The question I had, which I wanted to ask, was
Sorry,
no, it's just it just occurred to me.
we're very good
as
at
well.
tangents. This is why a 45-minute episode of our podcast takes 3 hours to record.
I love it. No, it's absolutely fantastic. Is the question I have is, as you talked about earlier, that we saw that the train and buses then tried to battle with the motor car and with the bus. Uh, Basically, even in the post-war period, I mean, the station that was near where I grew up, they modernised that in the 50s and 60s to try to create a modern look. And the question I really have is then what happened, because it feels like they kind of left that aside and let it just kind of, well, perhaps it's just a feeling, maybe it's just experience, but they kind of left that kind of try and keep up and try and battle with the car and just kind of almost embraced I guess the inevitable, I guess, in some ways, where the car just took over. Was
I
there
would
a
Yeah.
reason? Was there strategy, or was that just a
So
perception?
I would rebut that on some level, I
Yeah.
think. I think there are some organizations that really cared. As Simon's pointed out to the high-speed train behind him,
Mhm.
it's certainly they start a battle, an image battle going, and actually on the high-speed train, if you look up the advert, I forget the exact one, the title of it, but there's an advert where you have things like the phrase "Who's ever heard of a train jam?" and they have a another train painted up in police livery come along to pull over the high-speed train for speeding.
it's peak 1970s
It's
advertising.
amazing
Absolutely
advertising.
fantastic.
Um,
I love
but-
the original HSD advertising.
but they try and but they put organizations like British Rail put effort into this. I mean, even things like the APT, my darling child that I love. The APT is the photographs and adverts that were put out for the APT were very much look at the space age thing. Imagine traveling on this comfortable thing. We've got things like table service, which you would think would be almost silly to advertise. Why would that matter? But it's a whole thing of we're making your journey comfortable, we're making your journey luxurious. It's not just a thing to get you from A to B like the car is, or even like trains were in many cases, or was envisaged by people. But we are here to give you an experience at the same time. Come and enjoy this meal prepared by actually pretty competent onboard chefs who I'm currently researching some stuff about some privatization for something else. And when the onboard kitchens are then paired up in the, I forget what it is, Cuisine 2000 program, the chefs are absolutely fuming because they don't get to cook anymore and they're just reheating meals, and people notice it gets worse because of it, because people care.
And I think it's a complex one. There's two trains of thought. So I'll go first to just talk about demand a little bit. There's two trains of thought about how demand is impacted by what the railways are doing. And there are some people who will argue that demand is directly correlated to how well the railways are doing at drawing people in. And to an extent, that's true. But actually, by and large, I fall into the camp of saying that by and large, demand is actually mostly decoupled from what the railways are actually up to and is more to do with wider trends and wider designs and what people want to be doing. So to an extent, throughout the 1930s, 40s and 50s, the trend in society and through into the 60s and 70s is for people to seek the independence of personal transport and private transport. So the railways are kind of fighting a losing battle. And in that period, we see two interesting things occurring. We see, on the one hand, passenger demand drop off a cliff, and that leads to things like the 1960s Beeching report and the reshaping of Britain's railways, as it was officially called, and the huge closures that that entails. And so we see all this sort of cost cutting on one hand. And on the other hand, we see efforts, some successful, some not successful, to try and redesign the railway. And even the reshaping report is actually part of trying to redesign and reshape the railway to be competitive in those areas where it's felt that it could be. So that's commuter travel into London, where congestion, and some other big cities such as Manchester and Glasgow, where congestion is such on the roads that actually the train still provides a competitive option because you can fly past that congested traffic. Or, as I was pointing to earlier, intercity travel. When I'm streaming, I always get my fingers the wrong way, wrong side, pointing at things. Intercity travel. So we see the 1955 modernisation plan, which is an attempt to electrify and modernise large chunks of the railway. There's a whole debate about whether the modernisation plan was or wasn't actually a success. But why it failed if it did fail, but it's an attempt to modernize both passenger and freight operation to be competitive with road transport. We've hardly really talked about road freight transport, but that really hits the railways for non-bulk goods, things like steel and coal. Still to this day, really the only way to ship those in mass volumes is by rail. But your sort of domestic goods shift towards the road, and British Rail tries to fight back against that in the 1930s. In the 1960s and 70s, as Ella says, we have the APT program and the Intercity 125 behind me, which emerge as attempts to provide airline quality travel. Because this is, of course, as we go into the 1960s and 70s, we not only have the motor car, but we now have the cheaper. We're not yet in the budget airline era. Obviously, that's from the 1990s onwards, but we're into the mass market of air travel with jet airplanes and the arrival of, I can't remember which airplane it is specifically, but there's jet airplanes in this era that open up.
The 747, 707.
Yeah, all of these sort of planes open up air travel and domestic air travel as well, which of course,
yes,
the railway then finds as a competitor. And so we see to the one extent, we see the 125 being advertised against the motor car, but we also see it being promoted as providing a smooth, quiet, air-conditioned space with good quality food, comfortable seats, very much sort of selling the fact that actually it's providing you a plane's quality of service as well. So British Rail is sort of in this strange dichotomy of both, on some of its premier routes, being able to keep fighting against the motor car and keep fighting against the airlines, and on some of its less premier routes, or most of its less premier routes, it's being forced to cut back and strap back. And then we hit the 1980s. We're going way further forward than I was expecting this to go. So I'm sort of scratching at the stuff I do know about the 1980s and stuff. But we get into the 1980s and concerns change again. And suddenly congestion is getting really bad. And it tips over a tipping point, and suddenly people want to start using the train more because congestion's bad. And yes, in this period, there are improvements being made on Network Southeast and intercity subsectors of British Rail that bring people in. There are also improvements on parts of regional railways. So we see things like the Super Sprinter and the Sprinter classes of trains, so the Class 150s, the 158s, and the 156s, for those who know and care about train classes, which bring air conditioning. In the Super Sprinter, they bring air conditioning to longer distance regional services for the first time. They bring more comfortable seats, more comfortable journeys, faster journeys. So to an extent, all these improvements do help them fight back against the motor car and draw people back in. But also, with congestion increasing, people start tipping back. And then we come into the privatization era. And as we get to the millennium, we start getting concerned. We've got a ballooning population. So demand's going to go up anyway. And given the rail network doesn't grow between the 1960s and the early 2000s, and it doesn't grow, and it hasn't grown substantially in the last 100 years, if we do build HS2 in any meaningful way, it will be the first mainline railway built in Britain for 100 years, which is a complete outlier
Insane.
in Europe. So, of course, demand on the existing network goes up as the population grows and grows and grows, because even if only 10% of the population in any given year is using the train, as the population grows, that 10% is more and more people.
Yeah.
But we also see things like greater concern about the environment and our carbon footprint and all of that sort of stuff, and people being aware that actually using public transport is greener. And the problem, so this is where the point I'm getting to answer your question is, the problem I feel with this is that it then means that actually the railway companies perversely have no incentive to make things don't necessarily have an incentive to make things better to draw people in, because suddenly they've just got lots and lots of people who, for reasons unrelated to what service the railway is providing, are either forced into having to use the railway or opting to use it because it's the lesser of the bad planetary evil or whatever. And suddenly, actually, you can provide fairly basic trains like the 700s on Thameslink,
Or the
and
710
people
family.
will still use them. They will just use them regardless of the quality of what you're providing for other reasons. And I think this is sometimes where we are now. I'm also aware that outside of London, yes, as I say, like a lot of the regional network does get neglected under BR because it's just written off, and there's not enough. This is the other problem throughout the BR period, is there just is. It's the problem with always with the railways, is the rail network as a whole has never been profitable, and different bits of it have never been profitable, and so the government has never really provided BR enough funding to run the whole network to the quality that it would have liked that it should have been run to. So you do end up with some bits just having to be neglected because there isn't the money. You can't buy new trains for everywhere every 20 years because there just isn't the cash to do that. So you end up with bits of the network that do get neglected. So, like Ella, I would refute that the railways entirely give up on the aspect of trying to fight back against the competition from the roads, but I think in many places they are severely hobbled by government policy, and then today they are almost being served so many passengers on a platter now that they don't actually need to anymore, because actually if we're trying to compete, if we're trying to draw more, this is sometimes the problem we have in the modern rail industry, is if we actually try and bring more people in, it's slightly less of a problem after COVID, but we're still back at 2010, 2015 levels of passenger usage now. So it's not like the railways aren't being used. So trying to bring lots of new people in is potentially counterproductive, because there actually potentially isn't any more the capacity, because we're almost running, yes, there's been some improvements. There's been some service improvements. There's been signalling improvements and so on. But by and large, we're still running the same network that BR had in the 1980s, when it was at the bottom of its cuts that started in the 1960s.
And it's interesting.
So that's my flash through 50 years of railway history to try and answer that question.
It's also interesting to contrast what goes on in Britain with what goes on in Europe at the same time. And we see that Europe really starts investing in things like France obviously goes off on its TGV program, but at the same time goes on mass rolling stock purchases. You get all sorts of things go on in France to improve service. You get things like RER projects really take off and go full kind of, we're going to build massive I'd call them people superhighways through the city, to connect people up as much as possible. In Germany, after a bit of floundering and a bit of reunification, we get the ICE project, which comes out a bit earlier, but it's still mostly
I would say it's metros as well.
Yes, there's 1960s metros, but in terms of intercity travel, the ICE project starts coming about, and they start building again mass building of infrastructure for these new trains, as well as replacement of older trains. And moving forward to today, I think in general, Britain looks to Europe as kind of an example of what could have been in some ways.
Yep.
I mean, we look
And
at
you get
things
that
like
in Asia
Yeah.
as well with the Shinkansen and
Yeah.
stuff like that, which is a direct competitor to air travel and
and
massively reduces the market for air travel in Europe. And even
well,
and the one modern example of that in Britain, of course, is Eurostar,
yeah,
which is envisioned. Now, Eurostar, I'm sure will be an episode on the podcast at some point, because Eurostar's a fun case and interesting because it basically, its whole business case gets blown out the water by EasyJet. But Eurostar is envisioned as a competitor to British Airways. And in that regard, it's been like Eurostar has been largely successful on that. It has largely eliminated the it's hard to say because it's also partially alongside EasyJet and stuff, but it has largely eliminated the legacy carrier market for London, Paris travel on the airline market. And so I think we do get these veins in Britain and especially in Europe, as we say, as you say, we've got TGVs, ICEs, we've got metro systems, RERs, S-Bahns being. You go to Germany and
yeah,
any reasonably sized city has a 1960s U-Bahn of some form because they're still building them. And I think to sort of also throw something else in the mix, I think there's also, I mentioned it earlier, I think Britain also has that strange relationship of being drawn to being more like America. Even yes, there's a lot of resistance to that idea in Britain as well, but there's always this sort of temptation that we want to be a little bit more like America than perhaps we do Europe at times. And so we do follow a little bit more of that American model. That's not to say that we're the only country in Europe that rips up city centres to build the M6 through Birmingham and stuff. Although specifically, we're the only country in Europe that rips up the centre of Birmingham to build the M6. But I make a joke about the Germans helping to build motorways in Coventry and Birmingham as well. But
it's
yes,
also
there are urban
interesting.
freeways in other bits of Europe, but we do a lot of that in Britain. And so again, it brings us back to that sort of government policy. It's sort of government, especially after nationalisation, when the railways are answerable to government and they have to do what they have to follow government policy. Their hands are a little bit tied. If the government wants roads, we'll not get into this, but if, say, Marples, who's the Minister of Transport and has huge influence over rail policy in the 1960s, wants there to be a priority on roads, then that's where the government money is going to go. And this brings us back to what I was talking about earlier. That's where the government money goes. So therefore, BR, and also BR isn't supposed to be in competition with the roads because that's another government department. We're not meant to be competing with ourselves. And to an extent, that's sometimes a problem we still have today is we want railways to find new people. We don't want them to take people from the roads always. It's one of the issues HS2, regardless of its pros and cons, it's one of the issues that the business case for HS2's always had is the debate about how many people you could expect to try to switch from roads to trains and whether that's a thing the railway should even be trying to do. And that's not a debate I'm going to get into now. So this isn't the place for that, but that's sort of where government policy ends up going as well in this period.
What's also interesting, I think, is in British Rail as well, we see a push constantly for efficiency, and it's almost the polar opposite of what the car represents. The car ultimately is incredibly inefficient. Most cars only seat, despite seating, upwards in some cases of 7-8 people, only have a single person in them, and they're hauling with them, maybe their briefcase or rucksack, not either
average
the whole of
is what 1.2 or
they're not hauling the whole family or the entire contents of B&Q home. And at the same time, British Rail is always being pushed into an efficiency thing. We must be rationalizing our routes, we must be making better use of the available paths, we must have more and more we must try and get as many people comfortable but also onto this train as possible, especially today. And even with things that you wouldn't think of as being necessarily an efficiency thing, things like the introduction of the top system, the classification and I can only describe it as the operational management computer, because it is the computer when it's introduced, to manage how trains are going to be partly timetable, but most importantly, how what trains are going to be used to do what carriages are going to be used to do what freight cars are going to be used to do what. It's all done in the name of we must be more efficient. We must be trying to understand what's going on and understand this whole thing all at once. Whereas you've got the road network and the cars just kind of being allowed to, everything is done in isolation. Everything is your atomic existence. Whereas the railway is this kind of cohesive thing that's supposed to understand everything about itself all at once.
It does surprise me. It surprised me in some ways, as you said, because there's almost the kind of the polar opposites, aren't they, of what they are about and they do. And it does surprise me, like in the 50s and 60s, they didn't decide to actually integrate things together and actually make sure that actually they worked together to produce a system that actually maybe met both demands or whatnot. I mean, was that ever considered, or was that just
they tried?
Yeah,
I think there are some attempts, like the modernization plan to an extent involves that. There's fantastic roll-on, roll-off trains, which are supposed to sort of have lorry trailers that can also be plugged onto a rail bogie so that they can become part of a train. Those are
a bit like
containerization.
Things.
Yeah, it's sort of proto-containerization. Just it kind of gets killed because containerization comes round screaming around the corner a couple of years later.
Read the box.
And this is sometimes the problem the railways have, is they sort of go all out on investing in something, and then a development like containerization comes around and just blows. Because the railway invests in huge part of the modernization plan is investing in marshalling yards and hump shunting yards. So that's where you sort of have a train. It's trying to be more efficient, trying to combat with the motor car a bit more. You sort of have individual wagons in a train that sort of get shunted up a hump, and then they get sorted into different sidings. And that's get killed within a couple of years by containers, because containers are just so much easier to transship and everything.
So rather than having to have everything go over one hump, you can have just a load of things lined up and then a crane.
And so you end up with the railway pouring huge amounts of money into projects that end up not getting much of a return. And this is a vein you see through to today. It's an argument I've seen about HS2 and about investing in the railways from our current government, not wanting to get too political, not wanting to get and all of that sort of stuff. Of the railway is yesterday's technology. It is investing huge amounts of money in yesterday's stuff, and it ends up proving to be yesterday's stuff and out of date as soon as it opens. Whereas the road, you build a motorway, and that's flexible, and anything can go on it, anyone can go on it, any vehicle can go on it. Well,
except
not the initial motorways. They need massively rebuilding at various points to allow them to take heavier and heavier vehicles as time goes on. But they're seen as a much more safe investment from the government. And that kind of brings us back a little bit to the 1930s as well, because that's the same thing that the underground and everyone are fighting against in the 1930s, is this sense that the railways are dated. They're yesterday's thing. You see adverts and magazines talking about motor cars and motorbikes and planes and the modern technology, the new marvels, the modern wonders. And the railways are having to fight against that as early as the 1920s with adverts and publicity from organizations like the Underground Group, like the Southern Railway, who both electrify heavily in the 1920s and 30s. And for the Underground a little bit before, Southern electrifies heavily in the 1930s, and they're pushing the fact that they're using electricity, this novel technology. And it's also one of the factors that means that when the trams get withdrawn in London, they're replaced with trolley buses, because there is a perception that if they're replaced with motor buses, that will be seen as a step backwards. And that would not be good, because motor buses are internal combustion and they use a less advanced technology. Even though electric traction is older than motor vehicles, the electric motor, the electric trolley bus, is still perceived as being more technologically advanced than a motor bus. And therefore, there's a concern that if they withdraw trams for motor buses, that will actually be seen as a deterioration in the system.
And it's true today too. Interestingly, that effect we see today too, even when things like you'll replace a diesel bus route with, say, a hybrid, or more common now, an electric bus, and then the electric bus can't run for whatever reason, they put a diesel bus in it. You hear people actively complaining, why is this not the electric bus? Why isn't this clean? Why isn't this comfortable? Why is it noisy?
Yeah, because people's perceptions of what is modern and what not, isn't it? And those perceptions are battling out, aren't they? And it seems to be a common thing, especially with both the motor and with the train, is this battle of modernity that keeps going on for the whole time,
the
isn't it?
electric
And
car now.
Yeah,
that's the latest one, isn't it?
And as I started this whole thing off with, this is the thing I find so fascinating about all of this discussion from sort of the 1920s through to today. Is it's the same talking points, it's the same beats, it's the same things, and it's many of the same problems that have similar solutions. We can choose the same solutions now that we chose in the 1930s. Can we make people like public transport more by making things nicer and making trains more appealing? Yes, we can. Can we solve capacity issues by building a whole new railway like the Underground Group did in the 1930s when they built new tube lines? Of course we can. And do we have the same concerns over pollution, over noise, over comfort? All, of course we do. And that's why I find history so fascinating, especially modern history, because there's an aspect to which medieval and ancient history is harder to relate to because life was so different. Not to say I don't find older bits of history interesting. I very much enjoyed last week's the discussion from 2 weeks ago, which I tuned in for. Also, as a graduate from my undergraduate of Aberystwyth University, always love a little bit of Welsh history.
Perfect.
But I like that sort of older history. I like learning about the medieval period, but that's sort of a pastime. That's almost a hobby aspect to an extent of just sort of learning a little bit about that. Whereas stuff from sort of 1850 onwards becomes increasingly relatable as life begins to become more akin to what we're used to now. And that's why I find this sort of 1850 through to about 1950 period of history, that's really where a lot of my specialisms ended up. And that's why I find that such an interesting world, because it is different, but very relatable, and it's actually quite easy to sort of understand the concerns of people in that period.
Yeah, and I would completely agree with that. I think.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I mean, we can. I mean, it's probably a good time to maybe bring this to a close.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's a great way to do that, because, as you said, things that we've been talking about and concerns that they're going on today, we can find the answers. We can find hints and find answers in the periods that we've been discussing, the 30s all the way through to the 80s and even onwards. We can find the answers. We can find solutions. We can find understandings of that. So thank you both. It's been absolutely fantastic talking to you both about this. I've really enjoyed it. And
wonderful chatting to you.
Yeah, I hope that everyone's listening to this or watching this now or later on, as I know a lot of people will watch this at different times in America and all kinds of places, that you'll find this interesting. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
We'll say bye for now. Are there any more last comments you'd like to make before we do go?
No.
I was just going to, if it's all right to just do a quick plug, I was just going to say,
Please do.
If you want to hear us talk about this in more detail than we could do in an hour.
And edited.
And a bit edited. We've made now 10 episodes on my dissertation on the London transport history, and we've got at least 3 episodes coming up on Ella's dissertation on the Jersey railways. It's a little skewed because we've done a lot of the sort of background stuff on urbanism and city design and city growth as part of my work, whereas Ella's just sort of bringing content, a new case study. But you can find that at our podcast Rails to Nowhere, available on all good and some not so good podcast platforms, as well as we have YouTube. It doesn't have video like this. It's just a still image, but we put it up on YouTube as well. And if you search for Rails to Nowhere on Instagram or Twitter, we are semi-infrequently active on those platforms.
We make sure as well to put a link in the description as well, so people can
Yep.
find that as well. So
Thank you very much.
if you check descriptions out, there will be a link there. But that being said, thank you very much, and we will say bye for now.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Goodbye.